Boker Tov. Today's daf is daf Tes Zayin in Zbachim as we learn for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael on the Sunnah Batzar V'Shivya. Hopefully this war will end soon. Says the Gemara. Now on Tes Vavam Beis yesterday we started the second parak, and it begins by telling us the kinds of sulim, the people who cannot serve to do the avodah of the Beis Mikdash. We learned that even a zar, even a non-Kohen, can perform shchita. Shchita can be done by many psulim. However, Kabbalah, halacha, and zrika can only be done by Kohanim who are ksherim. And here we're going to talk about the people. We started to talk about the people who are not kosher. By the way, tomorrow we're back to regular time. Starting tomorrow, Yom Kippur, back to regular time, 5:20 a.m. Yerushalayim, 10:20 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time.
Have a cup of coffee.
Right. Have time for coffee. It's a mitzvah to have a coffee tomorrow morning. It's Erev Yom Kippur. You're supposed to eat, right? Okay. All right. So the Mishnah said that the following calls out if it was done, if the Kabbalah of the dam on a carbon was done by the following people who are disqualified from doing the avodah, from officiating, from doing the service of the Beis Mikdash, the carbon is puzzle. And if listed number one is zar, a non-Kohen cannot do the avodah from Kabbalah, and it refers to halacha and zrika as well. So yesterday we talked about zar. How do we know zar? So the Gemara brought down a pasuk. Then we had another opinion. Rav Meir Shapiro said he learned out of a kal v'chomer, and the kal v'chomer didn't stand because we want to learn a kal v'chomer from balmum, a balmum who can eat even though he can't do the avodah. So certainly a zar who cannot eat. Right, a zar who cannot eat certainly can't do the avodah. But we said, yeah, but that's different. Balmum is different because balmum could even be on the animal. The animal that's brought is also puzzle balmum, just like the Kohen is puzzle if he's a balmum. So then we said, well, look at tamei, person who's tamei can't do the avodah, right? Can't do the avodah. And we said that that's one of the isurim mentioned in the Mishnah too, like a tful yom and a tamei. And we said tamei uchiach that they're tamei, the animal doesn't become tamei, only a person does. So that doesn't have the quality of the balmum. And yet we see that and it says that a kohen who's a tamei cannot do the avodah. Be nozru, but lo yuchal, as we said that be nozru mikosher b'nei Israel. And the pashup shot is that the kohanim who are tamei should not do the avodah, right? So just like and if he did the avodah, he's machal the avodah. So we say the same thing. If a zar did the avodah, he's machal the avodah. Why? You learn out of a combination of balmum and tamei. That's what we said. So then the Gemara said, how do we know? Fine. Just like you see that a balmum and a person who's tamei, if they shouldn't do the avodah, they're prohibited from doing the avodah. And if they did the avodah, they're machal the avodah, they profane it, they make it puzzle, they disqualify the avodah, invalid. So the same way by a zar. But how do we know that a zar is even forbidden to do the avodah? He said those are forbidden to do the avodah. If they did the avodah, they puzzle it. How do we know the zar is prohibited? So the Gemara said in the 7th, 8th line, if you learn out from the pasuk, there it says if you're learning it based on that pasuk, not like there's like the first opinion we wanted to base it on the pasuk. If you're learning it, Baby Shmuel, not learning it, if you learn it from the pasuk, it says there lo yachal. So I know it's machal. I don't need this ma'atzad of balmum and tamei. Elami v'zar lo yachal yileikar alech. And that pasuk tells you the zar shouldn't come near to do the avodah. It's a different pasuk in Bamidbar. This is where we're up to. We left off yesterday about the 9th line on the page. Ikalam you can ask a question. Then what you're learning out? How do we know that a zar is machal the avodah from a combination of balmum and tamei from outside Hashem shekain lohud to bama. By a bama, a person who's tamei or balmum is not to do the avodah, right? So whereas a zar could do the avodah on a bama. Bama means that when the Beis Mikdash wasn't around, the Mishkan wasn't around, you're allowed to do private karbanos. You're allowed to bring a neder and a dava, even on a private altar that you made in your backyard. So, but you still can't do it if you're a balmum. Or if you're tamei, yet a zar could do that. So you can't. That is a different kind of a chumrah, whereas a zar has that kula. So zar shouldn't be able to learn from that. So don't say that you learn out of a combination. You learn out zar pasels the avoda from a combination of balmum and tamei, but rather ela ema onen yochiach. Now we're going to talk about onen today also. The first two psulim mentioned in the Mishnah of people who can't do the avoda, meaning Kabbalah Chazrika, are Zar, a non-Kohen, and an Onen. Onen is a person whose next of kin died that day. That day, he's an Onen. The first day, you're an Onen. That's really the only Avail Raisa. The other ones are Rabbanan. Even Shiva, the first 3 days are more Chumrah than the Shiva. That's all Rabbanan. It's learned out of Kabbalah from Sukkim in Tanakh, but it's not the Oraisa. The Oraisa, you're an Onen the first day. You're matapel with the Ades, and some say even after the death, even into the night, first day and the first night, the person's an Onen. So learn out from a combination of Onen. Now, an Onen, if it's a Kohen, also can't do the Avodah. We're going to see the Psukim why soon, but we know an Onen is prohibited to do the Avodah, and if he does it, it ruins it. So we'll say Zor is prohibited. How do we know Zor is prohibited? From a combination of Onen and Balmum. Says Mala Onen Shekin Aser B'Maiser, as it says Lo Achalti B'Oni Mimenu. I'm not also a Meiser, whereas a Balmum is not also in Meiser. So Balmum Yochiach is not also in Meiser, and therefore, and a Zar is also not. Of course, a Zar can eat Meiser, right? A Zar can eat Meiser. It's a Levi is a Zar also, and he give it to a Levi, and Yisrael could eat it in his house too. Each one has a different characteristic. That would be Onen and Balmum. The common denominator is that they are prohibited from doing the avodah. And if they do the avodah, it ruins it. Why don't we say the same thing? That a Balmum is not allowed to do the avodah. It's not allowed to do the avodah even on a bama. He's not allowed to be makar of a carbon on the bama, as well as a Onen, apparently. So they can't. They're not with the bama, whereas a Zar could do the bama. So how can you learn a Zar from a combination of Onen and Balmum? They have a chumrah that they can't even bring a carbon on a private altar at the time when Bamas were mutter, whereas a Zar is allowed to. Maskul Sama Braid the Rava, he asked this kasha, where do you get this idea that an Onen can't is also do the avodah? Dil Mashari Babama. Maybe we don't have any source for that. Maybe it's possible that an Onen, a person whose next of kin died that day, is allowed to bring on a bama, just like a Zar. So you could learn out Zar from a combination of Onen and Balmum, and that's the way you learn. So either you learn out from the pasuk, but the pasuk we had to put a comma in there, right? Either you learn out from the Kadshe and Bnei Yisrael lo Yechalu. That's how we know Zar is no good, or a combination, or it's learned out of a combination of Balmum and Onen. Okay, Rav Meir Shapiro. So we had 2 ways to learn out so far that a Zar cannot do the avodah. If he does the avodah, it ruins the avodah. As the Mishnah says, Kol Zbachim, if it was done by a Zar or an Onen and all the other psulim, puzzle, it makes it invalid. The carbon is no good. It's qualified. Rav Meir Shapiro brings a different drasha. Yoshev. Now Yoshev is also one of the ones mentioned in the Mishnah. It's towards the latter group of psulim, the latter of different psulim that we mentioned. The people who are disqualified, mostly Kohanim, besides the Zar. The other ones are, even if they're Kohanim, are puzzled to do the avodah. One of them, if he's sitting, you can't sit when you do the avodah. So let's learn a kabacham from Yoshev. What's a kabacham? Uma Yoshev she'ochel. A Yoshev, a Kohen who's sitting, is allowed to eat the carbon. He just can't officiate in the Beis Hamikdash at the service. Im avat chilul, and yet if he ate it, if he did the avodah, he's machal the avodah. How do we know that? Because we'll see that later on. We're going to learn it out later on. If he does the avodah, he's machal. Zar she'enochel. Zar is not allowed to eat the kadshe kachim. Certainly, if he did the avodah, he's machal the avodah. It's a kavachomer. Up, and mal yoshish came paslatus. Person sitting cannot do edus. It says va'amdu she'enashim. You have to, when you give testimony, you have to be a man, a kosher Jew, and a kosher male Jew, and you have to stand. So Yoshev has a chumrah because he can't. He's paslatus. So he says Yoshev tamachacham. Let's learn from Yoshev. A tamachacham is afforded the courtesy and the honor of, if he has to testify, he can sit because it's coveted for him to hit. So, okay, so for Yoshev Kavachot, from a Yoshev Tamachachim, you don't have the kasha mal Yoshev came pasalatus because he could sit down. Tamachachim could give testimony even if he's sitting. It's mal the shem. Okay, mal the shem Yoshev came pasalatus. But you're right. A Tamachachim himself cannot. It's not possible to do edus. But the term sitting we find is pasalatus by most people. So shem Yoshev la parach. Okay, that's not a kasha. So you can answer and say, listen, yeah, but we're not bringing proof from general people sitting. We're talking about from the Talmud Chacham. You have a combination of the kashas from Kal V'chomer, Yoshev, if a Yoshev, if he who's allowed to eat, If he did the avoda, he's machal zar shekan, he's not. I say mal yoshev shekan pasalatus. Yeah, look at the Yoshev Tamachachim. We're learning the Kavachomer from there. The imtam some brach, and even if you want to say that it is a good kasha, you can't ask a kasha. In other words, you can ask a kasha. Yoshev as a chumrah. You're right. Yoshev Tamachachim is can sit. It can sit when he does the. It's not pasul edus, but in general, a Yoshev is pasul to edus. The shame that we find by Yoshev that a pasul is. If you want to ask that a kasha, so asim Yoshev mechadam. I'll learn it from exact, not from the Kal V'chomer directly from Yoshev alone, but from the combination, the matzad of Yoshev and one of the other ones. What do you mean one of the other ones? So Rashi tells us onein otame or balmum. Remember before we tried to learn it out originally. How do we know that a zar is no good? So we said a kavachom from balmum. Balmum you can't ask because balmum, the animal can be a balmum like the makriv could be a balmum. Okay, combination of tameh. Okay, tameh has a different chomer. What's the combination of both of them? The combination of both of them had a problem. What masav shen shekain? They're not mutter by a bama. So then we came on to onein. We don't know that an onen is pasul, but maybe it is mutter bama. So we learned from the three of them. Now you were Rav Meir Shapiro was learning from Yoshev, and that Kal V'chomer doesn't work because he could say Mal Yoshev that's pasul edus, not the Talmud Chacham Yoshev, but in general Yoshev is pasul edus. Fine. So we'll learn out from Yoshev and one of the other ones. Right? The Yoshev the kasha b'bamanal. Why don't you ask a kasha? Right, that those things are all pasul b'bama. How do we know that if we asked before the other ones? Why can't we learn out from Tameh and from Balmum? Because they're pasul babama, whereas opposed to Zar. So he said, yeah, well, maybe Onen is also mutter babama, and therefore you could learn out Zar from there. What about Yoshev? Maybe that's also pasul babama. And if you learn it out from Yoshev and the other ones like Tameh or Balmum, they're also pasul babama. How do we know Yoshev is kash babama? The pasuk says, "Lama lifnei Hashem l'shosa," to stand before God to serve Him. Lifnei Hashem lifnei bama. Only before God, God's countenance, the Shekhinah is in the base of Mikdash or the Mishkan, not on a bama. So that's how we know that a Yoshev is mutter on a bama, and therefore you can learn it from there. So that's all describing. This was all to show how do we know that a Zor, a non-Kohen, cannot do the avoda, and if he does the avoda, he ruins it. Because you learn out either from the Kal V'chomer, and if they come either a pasuk of Bnei Yisrael v'lo yichalu, as we saw yesterday on Tesvav and Beis, or from a ma'atzad of Balmum and Onein, or according to Rav Meir Shapiro from Yoshev, and let's say an Onein, or Yoshev one of the, or Yoshev and Tameh, Yoshev and Balmum, learn out from a combination of them. So that's how you know that if it, like, what's the limud? Just like those are prohibited from doing the avoda. If they did the avoda, they're machal the avoda. They profane the avoda. The animal is a puzzle. The sacrifice is no good. It's disqualified. The same thing we say by azar. Then we said onein, person whose next of kin died that day. Now we're talking about even a kohen. Azar is a non-kohen. All the other psulim we're talking about even if they're a kohen. Now, what's the rule by a kohen? Let's understand something. A kohen cannot do the avoda when he his next of kin died that day, right? However, a kohen gadol is allowed to, right? What does the pasuk say? By the kohen gadol, it says, "Ba kohen hagadol me'achav," etc., etc. He shouldn't rent his clothes, etc. It shouldn't. So he's not allowed to. He's not allowed to be matame even to his next of kin. Only to a Meis mitzvah is he allowed to, but the pasuk is not to. Even though he's an avelus, he had an onen, his next of kin died that day, he still does the avoda. Aaron a kohen a gadol is allowed to do the avoda. Pardon?
He's not allowed to not do.
He's not allowed to do it. Right. He's right. He's not allowed to leave. He has to do the avoda. If he's in the mikdash, he shouldn't leave there. He does the avoda. Okay. Besides the fact it talks about who he's allowed to marry, etc. That's another issue. So the kohen gadol does the avoda even if he's an onen. Even if he's an onen, he does it. Let's say the kohen gadol is tameh. Does he do the avoda? No, he doesn't do the avoda. Right. Unless it's a carbon sibor. Carbon sibor hutter b'tzibor, because it says b'moado, you bring it at its time. Shabbos yont, if you have to bring a carbon, any kohen is mutter, even if he's tamei, to do the avodat sibor. This is all necessary. I'm giving this all as a preamble because how we're going to learn this out. So the Gemara says like this: Onein, about 10 lines from the bottom of Tesayin Aleph. Onein, how do we know that an onein is puzzle to do the avoda? If he does the avoda, he's puzzle. Of course, we mean what kind of an onein? An onein who is a regular kohen, a kohen hedyot. Kohen gadol, we just said, is not only, like you say, not only is he allowed to, he's not supposed to leave the base mikdash, supposed to do the avodah. Minoah. It says Umikdash lo yaitse, talking about a Kohen Gadol is not supposed to leave. V'lo yichalo. He shouldn't leave because if he leaves, he's machalo. Ha'acher shelo yatzachal. Mashma, only the Kohen Gadol is not allowed to leave, and leaving would be machal. But somebody else, if he didn't leave it machal, because he makes a dig, lo yaitse, who the Kohen Gadol is not supposed to leave, but mashma somebody else, another Kohen, shelo yatsa, who's supposed to leave. If he wasn't yotze, he was machal. That's how he learns the pasuk. Mikdash lo yaitse v'lo yachalel. Ha'acher shelo yatsa, somebody else, Kohen Gadol shouldn't leave. And if he leaves, he's machal the avoda. If he's in the base of Mikdash, he's not supposed to leave. He's supposed to do the avoda. Mashma that a Kohen Edyo is supposed to leave, and if he doesn't leave, he's machal. That's one way to learn. Rabbi Lazar Omer Mahacha, Heina Krivu, famous story that what happened when Nadav and Avihu died. Aaron's two sons, Nadav and Avihu, died when they brought the carbon there. They Sarah. So Moshe then came. Then they brought a carbon, and Moshe said to them, "Why did you burn the carbon? Why didn't you eat it? So why didn't you eat it?" So why? Because they did the avoda? Is it because they did avoda? So Aaron said, "Hey, Nikrivu, you think Elazar and Itamar, his remaining sons, you think they brought the carbon?" Now, the day that Nadav and Avihu died, who was an Onain? The father, Aaron Cohen, and the two brothers, Elazar and Itamar, right? So Aaron said to Moshe, "Do you think they brought the carbon and the psul, they were owning him, and that's why the animals puzzle?" No. That's what the pasuk is. Hey, Nikriv, that's the quote. He answered him. This is like what he understood. I need crafty. I brought the carbon, and I'm allowed to. I'm the Kohen Gadol. I'm allowed to. Mechlal the it's mashma that they brought the carbon. If Elazar and Itamar would have brought the carbon, Shapir stuff, it's proper that they burnt it. See, it's proper that they burn it. It's mashma that an owning is allowed to do the avodah. So that's a different Russia. So Rabbi Elazar, my time why didn't Rabbi Elazar in the first pasuk? The Kohen Gadol is not allowed to leave. Mashma, right? Mashma, somebody else didn't leave, they would be machal. The Kohen Gadol shouldn't leave because he would leave and be machal. Mashma, somebody else who didn't leave would be machal. The answer is, who says that diak? Miksiv ha'acher. It didn't say that. It says if a Kohen Gadol leaves, then he's machal. It doesn't say that a Kohen Hedyo shouldn't leave. That the Kohen didn't leave is machal. Maybe the Kohen Hedyo should leave, but if he didn't leave, he's not machal. We don't know. It doesn't say so he doesn't hold to that diak, that deduction. The and the first Tana, why did he learn like Rolas? My time famous machlokas. Why did they burn the carbon that they brought that day? Did they bring it because they were owning him, all of them? Now remember something: the Kohen Gadol is not allowed to leave, but he has to do the vote, but he can't eat. He's an owner and he can't eat it. So did they burn the carbon because there was nobody to eat it? In other words, who could have eaten it? Only the Kohanim. How many Kohanim were there that day? Aaron and his two boys. They were all owning him, and they were owning even at night. So therefore, if nobody could eat the carbon, you burn it like a carbon pesach. If a carbon pesach, the owners of a carbon pesach died that day, pesach is made to eat. If there's nobody to eat it, you got to burn it. You got to get rid of it. You got to destroy it. So he says. So one svara is because they were owning him. The other svara is no, because they were owning him. They weren't careful, and they couldn't eat it, and it became tumah. Something happened. They got tumah there. They weren't careful with it. If you eat it right away. It's reason, Kohanim's reason, right? But they didn't. Came tumah. So therefore, he said the reason Heiner Kifu is not to show that if they had, that you think they brought it. Do you think they brought the carbon? Says Aaron Cohen. I brought it. So I brought it. So okay. So if they would have brought it, they were owning him. That would have apostled it. But you could say the reason why they brought it, is because it was tummy. In other words, you think they brought it. Number one, it wasn't puzzle. They didn't puzzle it by bringing it. I brought it. The reason we burnt it is because there was nobody to eat it, and somehow it became tummy. So that's the machla. So therefore, you can't prove from there that an onain cannot do the avoda, because maybe the reason that they burnt it is because of tumah. Maybe you can't. In other words, he said, I brought it. There's no problem. I brought it, but we're owning him, and therefore it became tummy candidate, but not that we can't eat it because we're tummy, because we were owning him, but rather because it became tummy. But it doesn't prove that an onain cannot eat it. You can't prove that from there. You just say because it became tummy. Rashi, bring the last Rashi on the page on the inside. It doesn't mention at all owners. In other words, we not because of that, but because We didn't need it, and therefore it be one says machlokes, one says meituminis, v'chadam le'aninis susufar shlo yichol lachochla afil erev. So right near Slalanami also afil nikmar meis fish lo yochon nisrafa, because there was nobody to eat it, they burned it. That's one holds it was aninis. The other one says no, it became tamei. That's why they didn't eat it. V'lo niskushem aninis linyak krava at all. In other words, hey nikrivu, they didn't. You think they brought it? They didn't bring it. It became tamei. That's why we burnt it. So we have two psukim again, two psukim for how do you know that an onain kohen, a regular kohen hedyot who's an onain, ruins the avoda. And now we go back to ideas learning kal v'chomer b'almum, just like we saw. We learn out zar from kal v'chomer b'almum. Now we're going to learn out onain kal v'chomer b'almum. Uma b'almum sha'ocha marcha b'almum kohen b'almum who's allowed to eat karbanos. He's allowed to eat, just can't bring them, can't offer them. But if he did the avodas machalet, onain she'eino ochel, onain is not allowed to eat, right? As it says lo achalti b'oni mimenu. That's even by meiser. It says lo achalti b'oni, certainly by kodshim. So onain she'eino ochel, eino din shema b'chil. Certainly, if he did the avodas machalet, must malab b'almum sheken also about craving craving. Same kasha we asked on Amar Aleph. Onain b'almum is different. Why? Because Onan has a chumrah that not only if the kohen's a balmum, but even if the animal's a balmum. So it has that chumrah. Well, look at zar yochiach. Now that we've learned out zar, now we've learned out already that zar can't bring a look at zar. That is zar. You don't say that the if zar is also to the avoda, and by zar is not an issue of a balmum like the animals a balmum, but the zar is no issue of the balmum there. So you say look at zar. Right? Malazar shekain el takana. Zar is a chumrah. Once you're a zar, you can't become a kohen, no matter what. Right? No such thing. Right? But a balmum, right? So malazar shekain el takana. And you want to learn out what from an onain. An onain does have a takana. The next day he's not going to be an onain. He's only on the first day. But balmum yachich. Balmum could also get healed and no longer be a balmum. Not in all cases, but some cases he could. So we have a combination now of balmum and zar. What's the common denominator? Shem Muzar, that they're prohibited from doing the avoda, as we saw. Right? The Balmum says b'feiv she can't do the avoda. And the Zar we learned out of Sukkim, as we said on Aleph, either from the Sukkim or from the Ma'atzad, also do the avoda, v'imavdo chilo. Afar the avoda, I'll say the same thing. Onain, Shem Muzar, v'imavad chilo. Onain is also prohibited from doing the avoda. And if he does the avoda, he's machalib. It says, Heichen Muzar. No, where do you find that he's muzar? Where do you find it on can? If you're learning out mina mekdash lo yait, say that diuk. So chil begufik sebei. If it's there, you don't need a drush for there. You don't need another pasuk. If you want to mekdash lo yait, say v'lo yechalel, only going on the kohen gadol, but a kohen hedyo, just the opposite. If he does the avodah, he's machal. So the pasuk says befavorish there. So you don't need a pasuk for that. If you're learning out from the first drasha, you have mekdash lo yait say chil begufik seb. Elo meheni krivu. You learn out from that second pasuk of Heinikri. Do you think they brought the carbon? They didn't bring the carbon. And they need a sister, and they base it on that because it was burnt because of Venice. So you see over there that they're not allowed to, that they're prohibited from doing the avoda. That's their avoda. How do we know that if they did the avoda, they're machalalit Heinikrivu? Because it says that's from the matzad of Balmum and Zar. Just like Balmum and Zar are prohibited, and if they did the avoda, they profane it. The same way. He's an onain who's prohibited from doing the avoda. Why? Based on the Heinya Kriv, who can't do the avoda. If you learn from the pasuk Heinya Kriv, you think they brought the avoda? They're not allowed to do the avoda if they were owning him. How do we know they're machalid based on the matzah? You can say matzah shekain lahuter machlalo. Listen to this. That's never machlal, meaning a balmum and a zar are never mutter. There's no circumstance in which a balmum could do the avoda, whereas we're learning out onain could do the avoda, in which case, if he's a kohen gadol. So there's a heter there, right? The machal and zar balmum are always aser. They're aser sheneser and mikdash lo itreitzel shum carbon itreitzel shum adam. No carbon. They can never. A balmum can never bring any carbon, and a balmum can never, under circumstances, even if he's a kohen gadol, do the avoda. Right? The same balmum or a zar. Tomer ba'onain shut machal. It's a kohen gadol. So there has a kula. So how can you learn out owning from the combination of Balmum and Zar? It says Tamei Yuchiach. Okay, so look at Tamei. A Tamei has a heter. How's a Tamei? Where's a Tamei mutter? Carbon seaboard. Tamei. Mal Tamei shekain Matame. Tamei has a chumrah that it's Matame other things, that it causes other things. Balmum and Zar doesn't cause defilement of other people. So look at the Balmum and Zar. So now we have a combination of three things: Balmum, Zar, and Tameh. They're prohibited, right? And they ruin the avoda. Same way, since the onain is prohibited from doing the avoda, as we saw from Hainic Revi, you think my boys brought our coin said you think my boys did it, they're not allowed to. But since we see they're not allowed to, and from the combination of the other three, we see that if you're not allowed to, you profane the avoda here too. Why don't you say this? The combination of three of them they're not mutter by a kohen gadol, by a carbon yachid, right? By a carbon yachid, not allowed to do the avoda of a kohen's not allowed. Even a kohen gadol can't do the avoda when he's tamei, or certainly if he's a balmum, it can't be a zar. But point is that there's no hitter machlon there. Whereas by an onain, a kohen gadol who's an onain could do the avoda even of a yachid. Kohen gadol's min mekdash lo yaitze. He's supposed to do the avoda. He doesn't stop doing anything, even by a yachid. So why don't you say the combination? It's a shame tumah miyastri, but the fact is, tumah is mutter in some sense. It lets out its call because the kohen gadol, because it's mutter to do the avoda of the tzibur. You want to say that there's a combination of the three of them. Whereas an onain could bring, even a kohen gadol could bring a carbon yachid. But the fact is, shame tumah mia istri. But the fact is that you find that there is a heter there of a shame tumah. It's not heter in the case of a kohen gadol by a carbon yachid, but you do find shame tumah because tumah is heter b'tzibur, and therefore you find a heter there mechlala. All right, so that's the second way to learn, or I should say a third way, because we have two psukim. We have the pasuk of minimikdash lo yetze v'lo yachalo by kohen gadol ha'achar shlo yotza chilo, and then we have the pasuk of heinik rivu. And if you learn the basic of Heinik Rivu, then you come on to the Mahatzad, of this three-way Mahatzad, to tell me that if they did the avoda, they ruin it. Rav Meir Shapiro, remember Rav Meir Shapiro on Amud Aleph? How did he learn out that a Zar can't do the avoda, that he ruins the avoda? Well, not that he can't do the avoda, that he ruins the avoda from Yoshev. Here he learns out onin also from Yoshev. Rav Meir Shapiro, Amar also B'Kal V'Chomer Yoshev. Madach a kohen gadol who's sitting. Ma Yoshev, he's allowed to eat the carbon if he's sitting. But he can't do the avoda. If he did the avoda, he profanes it. Onain she'eino is not allowed to eat it. An onain can't eat it. Interesting. You were saying a kohen gadol who's an onain could do any avoda, but he can't eat. He's still an onain. So onain she'eino and it didn't shemavashil. Certainly should chill. Here we're talking about a kohen head. It says Mali Yoshev came pasolatus. Again, we said before a Yoshev is pasolatus, whereas an onain is not pasolatus. It says Yoshev Tamachacham. Yoshev Tamachacham is not pasolatus. It says Mal Shem Yoshev became pasolatus. But in general, you find there is a Yoshev that is pasolatus, even though it's not the Tamachacham. But Shem Yoshev Park. We're not asking from general Yoshev. You said that's not a kasha. The same thing we said at Amud Aleph. Shem Yoshev is not a kasha because we're asking from a Yoshev Tamachacham. Yoshev Tamachacham is not pasolatus. So, but you want to ask from Shem Yoshev, that's not a kasha, that Shem Yoshev is pasolatus. Yoshev Tamachach was not pasolatus. Even if you say it is a kasha, Asim Yoshev and Mechanarach, very good. So learn enough from a combination of Yoshev and one of the other ones, right? Rashi says here, Rashi doesn't tell Shem Tum Mi'ishri. Rashi, there's no Rashi on these words. So learn it out from a combination of Yoshev and Balmum or Tameh or Zar. Learn out from Yoshev a combination of them, and you can't ask a kasha there because these people are. When you ask, just like those are puzzle, they're also do the voda. If they did the voda, it's puzzle. The same thing we'll say by an onain. And if you say Yoshev is different because Mali Yoshev is puzzle for Adis, the other ones are not puzzle Adis, and Tameh or whatever. The other ones are not puzzle Adis, and therefore you can learn up from a combination of Yoshev and one of the other three, just like we saw before. They learn a combination of those three of Balmum, Zar, and Tameh, right? And Tameh, that those are puzzle to the also the voda and they're puzzle to the avoda. The same thing we'll say by onain, or you can learn from Yoshev and one of the other ones. Now, before we get into the other ones of Tful Yom and Mechusar Kippurim, how do we know that those things profane the avoda? The Gemara is going to say an interesting thing. It says like this: onain puzzle Amar Rava lo shel b'carbon yachid. And onain is only puzzled by a carbon of a single person. Aval b'carbon tzibur, if it's a carbon for a tzibur, maratza. then an onain could do the avoda. We're talking about an onain going kohen hedyot. Kohen gadol is certainly allowed to. That's what he wants to say. How do I know that? Kal v'chomer mituma. Now the pasuk doesn't say that. The pasuk says in general, an onain kohen gadol always does the avoda. An onain kohen hedyot never does the avoda. Right? Never does the avoda. That's what we just said. It only doesn't do the avoda. Tuma, a kohen tameh is not allowed to do any avoda. Even a kohen gadol whose tameh cannot do the avoda of an individual person. But for a carbon sibor, even a kohen hedyot is allowed to do the avoda. The moedo, right? So now he says like this. So Rava wants to say a chiddush. He says, you know what? This that we say that an onain can't do the avoda, it's only by a carbon yachid, but by a carbon sibor it works. Maratza, it's accepted. How do you know? Kal v'chomer mituma. Ma tuma shelo utem machlal eitzel kohen gadol. Even a kohen gadol can't do the avodah when he's tamei. But carbon yachid hutra eitzel hiyajad. But a kohen hedyot is allowed to do the carbon sibor. Aninos shehutra machlal eitzel kohen gadol. But carbon yachid. Aninos a kohen gadol is allowed to do the avodah even if a carbon yachid when he's an onain. And it didn't hutra eitzel kohen hedyot. But carbon sibor should also be mutter to do a kohen hedyot by a carbon sibor if he's an onain. In other words, that's what you want to say. Rava wants to say that chiddush. That an onain is not, it's not absolute that a kohen hedyot can never do the avoda. By a carbon sibor, you could. Maskell Rabba Bar Eloi. So Rabba Bar Eloi asks the question, and he says, if you're going to say that kal v'chomer, then everything falls apart. Everything. Why? I'll show you the opposite. So lo tutranina says so kohen gadol b'kram yach. I'll tell you that if that's the case, an onain kohen gadol should not allow to do the avoda of a carbon yach, which we know isn't the case. You could do the avoda period. Mikal v'chomer. Say this kal v'chomer. Ma tuma. Tuma shuot eitzel kohen hedyot b'tzibur. If it's mutter, lo hutra eitzel kohen gadol b'carbon yachid, as we saw, with that we know, right? Tuma eitzel kohen hedyot b'tzibur is mutter. By kohen gadol, it's not even mutter b'yachid. Aninas shelo eitzel kohen hedyot b'carbon sibur. Aninas, which is not mutter by kohen hedyot. Remember, an onain kohen hedyot can't do anything about it. Certainly can't do the avodah by carbon sibur. And a din shelo tutra eitzel kohen gadol b'carbon yachid. Certainly should not. You could say that kal v'chomer. And if that's the case, it changes everything. And I'll say another one. But maybe a kohen gadol who's tamei should be able to do a carbon yachid. Mikal v'chomer. Ma'aninas shelo eitzel kohen hedyot. But carbon sibor, ma'aninas, which is not mutter by a kohen hedyot by carbon sibor. Again, not like Rava said, but that's the way we know. A kohen hedyot is not to do an onain. Period. Hutra eitzel kohen gadol but carbon yachid. But a kohen gadol who's an onain could do the avoda even by carbon yachid. Tuma shehutra eitzel kohen hedyot b'carbon sibor, a tuma which a kohen hedyot is allowed to do by carbon sibor, and it didn't eitzel kohen gadol b'carbon yachid certainly should be allowed to. You could say such a kal v'chomer, but it goes against our understanding, against the psukim. And a third one, below tuma eitzel kohen hedyot b'carbon sibor. I'll tell you, even though it says b'moedo, we know even a kohen hedyot is allowed to do the carbon sibor if it's Shabbos or whatever, even if he is tamei. So I'm saying no. I'll say a kohen hedyot shouldn't be allowed to do a carbon sibor kal v'chomer. Ma'aninas. A kohen gadol, each one is learned by itself. It's not based on the other one, obviously. A kohen gadol, what is allowed to do the avoda, even by a carbon yachid when he's an onain, lower trace of kohen hedyot carbon sibor, but an onain who's a kohen hedyot cannot do the avoda even carbon sibor. Tuma shelo trace of kohen gadol carbon yachid. Kohen gadol is a tummy cannot do the avoda at all, even by carbon yachid. And additionally, to the kohen hedyot carbon sibor shouldn't be allowed to. So if he's tummy, shouldn't be allowed to. A kohen hedyot who's tummy shouldn't allow to be do the avoda by a carbon sibor at all. So you could say this. You could always see these kal v'chomers back and forth. In other words, Rava started off by saying a chiddush. He said, you know what? Oh, an onain is not allowed to do the avoda. Well, maybe that's by a carbon yachid, but by a carbon sibor not. And I'll say a kal v'chomer. No kohen, even a kohen gadol can't do the avodah by carbon yachid, but he's allowed to do. But a kohen hedyot is allowed to do by carbon sibor. Aninas, where a kohen gadol is allowed to do by carbon yachid. Certainly, a kohen hedyot should be allowed to do the avodah by a carbon sibor if he's an onain. You could say such a kal v'chomer, but you could say kal v'chomers back and forth both ways. Kol chad v'chad, take it with Ella, kol chad v'chad, put each one the way we have it. In other words, he's asking a kasha. Rabbi says, that look at the top Rashi here on Yuzayim and Aleph. Yesh lo, you could yesh lahachlet. For lo neda, he says, Mishnah, well, how do you know which way to darshan? You could darshan that a kohen hedyot is never allowed to do the avodah in his tummy, even by a carbon sibor. And you could darshan that a kohen gadol is not allowed to do the avodah when he's an onain by a carbon yachid. Hilkach kocha says you don't know which way to go. Hilkach kocha beduchte. Says leave it the way the pasuk says it's stam. Shehutra ninas lekanu when the pasuk said what? Make the shlo said the kohen gadol is allowed to do the avoda when he's not allowed to, and he must do the avoda when he's a onain. Stam ben diach ben tzibur. Whether it's a yachid or a tzibur, he's allowed to do the avoda. Kohen gadol who's an onain can do the avoda. Period. Putra. Ukshenesra lehedyot. And when we said that a Kohen Hedyot is not allowed to do the avoda when he's an onain, either based on the pasuk of a minhag shlo yesei or from hein hikrivu, or from the combination that we said from the three-way combination of balmum, zor, and tameh. From there, when we said that a Hedyot is not allowed to do the avoda when he is an onain, when it's bein b'yachad bein b'tzibur nesra ukshehutra tuma b'tzibur. Based on the moado, remember you have to bring a carbon in its time. If it's a carbon seed, you got to bring its time even betuma. Hutra afla kohen hedyot. It says a period. Ukshenesber carbon yachid. And by carbon yachid, a kohen who's tamei is not allowed to do the avodah of a carbon yachid. Afla kohen gadol. In other words, these things were learned out stam. So don't start making differences between tzibur yachid on your own, because if you're going to learn these kal v'chomers, you can say kal v'chomers both ways, all the ways, and therefore that doesn't work. All right, tomorrow we'll pick it up. We'll start with learning from Tful Yom, which is the third thing mentioned in the Mishnah is a psul, whether a person is a non-Kohen or whether he's a Kohen Hedyot who's an Onain, a Kohen Hedyot who's an Onain, or if he's a Tful Yom. Remember, Tuma is a Tuma, a Kohen who's Tameh cannot do the Avoda, even if he's a Kohen Gadol. But if he's an Onain, he could. So tomorrow 5:20, back to the regular schedule of 5:20 as we do throughout the year, 10:20 New York time. Wow.